3 John. Authorship, who wrote this epistle? Well, the elder. The elder. Which is also how 2 John is introduced, right? The elder, 2 John 1, 3 John 1, the elder. So there's no reason why this couldn't be the same individual, and there are strong similarities with 1 and 2 John, so there is every reason to believe that John the Apostle is the author of this one as well. Now, we might raise the question, why are these epistles so short? And I've given you on the bottom of your handout there a couple of references. Turn back a page to 2 John, verse 12. Notice what he says. Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. Okay, now turn over and look at 3 John, verses 13 and 14. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. So virtually the same thing is said in both these epistles. Turn over to page 6. I think I've given you an explanation. Is it on there? I got the wrong sheet. Yes, these the length of each of these letters would have fit on one normal sheet of papyrus. Papyrus was our equivalent of paper. Okay, and it was pretty hard to come by. Okay, so John limited himself to this much because he hoped to pay his readers a personal visit, and he says that in both these letters. So that's why these are very brief epistles. He writes a little bit. He's planning to come to see them. Okay, readers. Reader is identified for us as Gaius, sent to an individual. Now, it seems from what we read in this epistle, 3 John, that Gaius provided hospitality to true Christian teachers. You remember in 2 John, the issue was, don't welcome false teachers into your house, into the house church. Because if you do that, you participate with them in their false teaching. Well, 3 John balances out what he says in 2 John. You might, after reading 2 John, be so cautious that you don't welcome anyone. And so what John is doing here is encouraging those who actually did, Gaius in particular, who did welcome these traveling teachers who were true Christian teachers, who were not teaching heresy or false doctrine, who were teaching truth. And so he writes to encourage them. Actually, let's look at verses 5 through 8 to see this. 3 John 5. Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Kind of following Paul's pattern. He wasn't willing to accept anything from others, so he wouldn't give people the impression that he was in this gospel ministry for the sake of money. Notice verse 8. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. That's a very profound verse. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. Now, maybe you don't have the gift of teaching, and you're not going to be a missionary or something like that. But by supporting other people who are in that kind of ministry, whether financially or through hospitality, notice what John says. You are fellow workers for the truth. So you have a vital role to play in their ministry. You're fellow workers with them for the truth. I think that's a really helpful verse to encourage us to give to those who the Lord is blessing and using in the ministry of the gospel. Okay, date, same as the other epistles of John, early 90s. And purpose. As you read this short epistle, you see that John had received back a report from his associates about the church that's connected with this Gaius. And while we just saw he was commending Gaius, there's another problem, though, and there's a troublemaker in the church. Look at verses 9 and 10. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. So here's a church leader who is not a good guy at all. He's very selfish, puts himself first, and is spreading rumors, negative things about John, and causing all kinds of trouble in the church. If you ever are serving the Lord and trying to be faithful, inevitably you will face some criticism. And notice what John says in verse 9. Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So he was rejecting the authority of the Apostle John. But keep reading verse 10. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. You ever had people do that about you? It's really frustrating, isn't it, to be misrepresented? But you can almost expect it in the Lord's work. So you got to grow some tough skin and trust in the Lord and leave things to Him. But also there is a point in which you confront. And that's what John was going to do for the sake of the church, the health of the church. Sometimes these things need to be confronted and dealt with. All that to say, here's a purpose statement. Twofold purpose, really, to encourage Gaius to continue to support Christian missionaries. Remember the background of 2 John here. There's false teachers going around that you're not supposed to welcome, but you should welcome and support the Orthodox Christian teachers, missionaries. The second purpose, to condemn the self-centered troublemaker Diotrephes. So much for 3 John. Let's move on now to our notes for today, the book of Revelation. By the way, I have some extra notes from this section of the course, starting in Thessalonians. So if you're missing a set of handouts, you missed a day, come see me afterwards, and I might have what you need. Okay, the book of Revelation. I want you to notice something here in Revelation 1:1. The revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay? So when you refer to this book, don't say, turn to Revelations chapter 2, verse 4. Okay, it's Revelation, singular. Just a little pet peeve. So, who wrote the book of Revelation? Well, the author, by the way, this is the only Johannine writing where John identifies himself as John. And he does that 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Sounds like a good exam question, right? Because what else did John write? Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. So A, B, C, D, E. That'd be a perfect multiple choice question. What is the only Johannine writing where John identifies himself as John? Okay, now, who's he writing to? Who's he writing to? The 7 churches in Asia Minor, right. Now, you remember, according to tradition, John spent his last days in Ephesus, or he spent his last years ministering in Ephesus, was then exiled to Patmos, probably returned to Ephesus. And so John is writing to Ephesus as well as the other churches he mentions in Asia Minor. What's the problem with the church at Ephesus? They left their first love, right. And if you look at 1 John in particular, he's dealing with the issue of love again and again and again. You got to love one another. You got to love God, love one another. Those two things are related. And so when he writes the message from Christ to Ephesus is, you've left your first love. May be why John is spending so much time in 1 John hammering this issue of love. He doesn't need to identify himself more than just John. He doesn't say John the Apostle. He just says, John, your brother, verse 9, your brother and partner. But the readers knew very well who he was. I put on your handout here that there's strong early Christian testimony to the Apostle John as the author, and on your handout I point out that no New Testament book has a stronger, earlier tradition about its authorship than does Revelation. In other words, the 2nd century writers all identified John the Apostle as the author. It's interesting because in the 3rd century there's someone by the name of Dionysius who says it couldn't be John the Apostle who wrote this. It's got to be another John. And basically, according to Carson and Moo, it was because Dionysius didn't like the premillennialism of the book of Revelation. And so he said, well, it couldn't be the Apostle John. So there were some, you probably come across, if you read in the literature, some of the church fathers didn't think it was the Apostle John. But the earliest testimony all affirms that it's the Apostle John. Now, of course, we've talked about this issue many times. Liberal scholars, not even necessarily liberal scholars, but other scholars today don't think that John the Apostle wrote this. It's got to be another John, because the Apostle John's writing in the Gospel of John, the epistles are very different from the book of Revelation. Well, what's the easy answer to that? It's a different genre, right? It's a different literary style. He's writing apocalyptic literature, which is very highly symbolic, all kinds of images. That's how apocalyptic... The book of Revelation isn't the only piece of apocalyptic literature. There's all kinds of apocalyptic literature during this time. So it was a familiar genre. The other thing is, John is an eyewitness. He's receiving instructions. He's receiving visions. He's being told what to write. And so that accounts for some of the stylistic differences. But there's also many similarities with his other writings. We won't take the time to get into that. What were John's circumstances as he wrote the book of Revelation? Where was he? The island of Patmos. Look at chapter 1, verse 9. 9 through 11. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, And I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see in a book, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea." And then he gives us this vision of the glorified Christ. This is Revelation 1 is a great passage to meditate on. If you just think of Jesus in terms of the way you see him presented in Sunday school material, in the white robe with the blue sash and the lamb on his shoulders or something like that, Jesus is now glorified. And Revelation 1 gives us insight into the glorified Christ. And it's a very important way to think about Christ. Okay, Patmos, though. Well, first of all, he's writing to the 7 churches. This map's on your handout. There's Patmos there, and then Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Some pictures of Patmos. It was a small little island in the Aegean Sea. Rocky island. There's the west coast of Patmos. There are some people that live there. You can see there. Another shot of Patmos, but pretty barren place by and large. John was, according to verse 9, John was in Patmos because of his faithful witness to Jesus Christ. That's what he tells us. And we also know from the history of this time that the Romans often would send their political prisoners to some of these islands in the Aegean Sea. If you look at your map on your handout or up here, you can see there's a number of these little islands in the Aegean Sea, and that's where the Romans sent political prisoners. So it fits well with what we know of Roman practice. According to early church tradition again, this is on your handout, John was banished to Patmos in AD 94-95 during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. This early testimony also says that John was released shortly after Domitian died in AD 96 and then lived out the rest of his days in Ephesus and died there. Emperor Domitian is known to have been cruel, not to the extent of Nero, but there was some persecution of Christians. He was really egotistic. He demanded that his subjects address him as Lord and God. So emperor worship was cranked up a notch with Domitian. Okay, date. Strongest and earliest testimony we have dates this book approximately 95 AD during Domitian's reign. Some scholars argue for different dates, like before the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll see that in a minute, which would put Revelation during Nero's reign. Okay, page 2. Let's look or think a little bit about interpreting Revelation, because whenever you mention the book of Revelation, there are a couple of different responses, at least a couple, and they can at least be extreme responses. On the one extreme, you have people that have such a fascination with the book of Revelation that they almost become fanatical about it. I mean, they make predictions about when the Lord's coming back, or they try to pin the tail on the Antichrist, or they're reading the newspaper along with the book of Revelation and trying to identify certain events as actually happening, or this kind of thing. And some people, it's almost like Revelation is the only book they read because they're so fascinated with it. Other people, because the book is highly symbolic, they're intimidated by it with all the symbolism and everything, and so they tend to avoid the book altogether, except maybe the last couple of chapters and the first few chapters. Stuff in the middle they just don't even pay attention to. John Stott says this. He says, "To start reading the Revelation is to step into a strange, unfamiliar world of angels and demons, of lambs, lions, horses, and dragons. Seals are broken, trumpets blown, and the contents of 7 bowls poured out on the earth. 2 malicious beasts appear. There's thunder, lightning, hail, fire, blood, smoke. The whole book appears at first sight to contain many strange and mysterious visions." So it's true that many of the details can be difficult to understand with exact precision. And so that's why some would exhort us when we're dealing with the book of Revelation to use the hermeneutics of humility. In other words, interpret this book with a humble spirit. Now, having said that, I think it's very important to add that the message of the book, the overall message of the book, is very clear. In fact, J. Sidlow Baxter says that in its total significance, in its focal message, the book is actually perhaps the easiest to understand. That might sound a little strange. The book of Revelation, the easiest book in the Bible to understand. Well, he's saying again, in its big idea, in its overall message, it's easy to understand. Maybe you've heard the illustration. I like this illustration to illustrate this point that Revelation is the easiest book to understand. There was a group of seminary students who used to get together once a week and play basketball at a local gym, and it was usually later at night. And so there would be just a single person in the stands, the caretaker, the janitor, whatever you call him, and he would be there waiting for the students to finish so he could lock up and clean up. But he would always inevitably be reading his Bible. And so this was of interest to the seminary students. So as they walked out one day, they asked him, "Hey, what are you reading?" And he said, "I'm reading the book of Revelation." And one student asked him, "Well, seminary students, here's just a janitor." He said, "Well, do you really understand the book of Revelation?" And the man said, "Oh yes, I understand it. It means Jesus is going to win." And you know what? That's a good way to summarize the book of Revelation. Jesus is going to win. In a nutshell, that's the message. Jesus is going to win. And so, for example, we see the victory of God, the triune God. We see God the Father at work, the Son, the Spirit. The victory of God over Satan and evil. We see the establishment of the millennial kingdom and the rule of righteousness. We see the eternal state where believers enter into paradise and there's no more curse. And that glorious, glorious state. And on your handout, J. Ramsey Michael says this: at the heart of the book of Revelation is a story about a slain lamb, victorious over death and evil, and a God who makes everything new. That's a great, great message. So the message is very clear, but how we approach the particulars, the details, and understand specifically what they refer to is obviously very debated. And so you have a number of different interpretations. For example, how do you understand the beast of chapters 11 and 13? Ooh, ouch. Is everyone okay up there? Is it Nero? Was it Nero? Is it some future Antichrist? Is it Hitler? The Pope? That, by the way, that was the interpretation of the Reformers. The beast was the Pope. The 3.5 years described in chapters 11 through 13, is that the destruction of Jerusalem? Is it the church age? Is it the last half of the tribulation? All kinds of different views on that. I want to look at 4 basic approaches with you, and obviously we don't have time to go into detail, but let me give you the big picture of these 4 basic approaches for the book of Revelation. First of all, we have the preterist approach, and I've indicated from a Latin word meaning past. And basically this approach sees the events of the book as having been fulfilled already. Some would say the return of Christ described is still future, but everything else basically took place in John's lifetime. In other words, everything described in the book of Revelation refers to first century events. That's when John's writing. That's what he's describing. John told the original readers how God was going to deliver them from their oppressors. Now, some in this school would say that, in other words, this particular approach has a couple of different options. Some would say that the book was written before AD 70. Most of them probably would say that, actually. And finds its primary fulfillment in the destruction of Jerusalem, which they would say was the Battle of Armageddon. Some others would say, and this is the second point, that the first half of Revelation describes the fall of Jerusalem, but the second half predicts the fall of the Roman Empire, and then the second coming of Christ. So, to get that perspective, most would date Revelation before AD 70. A lot of amillennial people would take a preterist view. Second basic interpretive approach. Sorry, you're not done? You need me to go back? The second basic approach is the historicist or historical approach. And I'll describe it in a minute, but this was a fairly popular approach during the Protestant Reformation. Basically, this approach argues that the events described in the book of Revelation are fulfilled throughout church history. Culminating in the return of Christ. So, the difficulty with this particular view, however, is people would identify different events described in the book of Revelation with different historic events. So most interpreters aren't consistent in this approach. As I mentioned, popular among the reformers like Martin Luther and those who came after them like John Wesley, Whitefield, Spurgeon held this view as well. And they still identified, as I mentioned, the Pope as the Antichrist. This view is not as popular today. You still might see it show up from time to time. The third one is an interesting one. It's called the idealist approach. And basically, this approach does not see the events of the book of Revelation as corresponding to any specific historical, or for that matter, future event other than maybe the return of Christ. But rather, what John is doing is basically writing about the struggle between good and evil, the struggle between God and evil, and the church and the world. And so you have all this symbolic imagery of the dragon and the beast as a struggle against Christ, and the battle of Armageddon represents the ongoing battle between the church and the world, and then the ultimate victory of Christ. So, for example, some commentaries that you could find by William Hendrickson or Philip Hughes, they would see things like the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments described in the book of Revelation. They would see those not as future things described in the tribulation period, but just a picture of God's judgment on sinners at all times. And the beast refers to all anti-Christian empires or rulers in history. Okay, let me give you the correct view, and that is the futurist view. This view basically looks at the events starting in chapter 4 through the end as future. The message to the churches, chapters 2 and 3, obviously John was writing to real churches in Asia Minor, and those, just like the other epistles in the New Testament, those have principles for churches of all time. But starting in chapter 4, John is describing things that will take place in the future. And he's describing the end, really, of world history. You see the return of Christ as a victorious warrior in the battle of Armageddon, described in chapter 19. Well, that hasn't happened yet. You can't spiritualize it because it's an event that hasn't happened yet. The millennial kingdom where Christ will reign in perfect righteousness, that hasn't happened yet. The great white throne judgment, where Satan and his hosts, his followers, are condemned to the lake of fire, that hasn't happened yet, because 1 Peter tells us that our enemy is prowling about like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He's not bound in the lake of fire. The eternal state obviously hasn't happened yet. The events of the tribulation described in chapters 6 through 19, where you have cosmic events, that hasn't happened yet. So the futurist approach is the premillennial approach. Your textbook pointed out that not all premillennialists are dispensational. That is their view of Israel and the church and some other points along the way. But what do we mean by premillennial? What would be a basic definition of premillennial? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Before the millennium. What happens before the millennium? Okay, and Christ's return before the millennium, and then he sets up the millennial kingdom. Right? Whereas, you remember maybe from reading the post-millennial, we bring in the millennium by preaching and that kind of thing, and then Christ returns. Well, to me, that's a hard sell, that one. And millennium, this is the millennium now. If this is the millennium now, it's kind of disappointing. Some commentators will combine various elements from these approaches, and I think there is actually something to learn from the different approaches. We shouldn't just dismiss them as totally out to lunch. There is some things we can learn. For example, the preterist approach at least reminds us that this book did have relevance to the first readers. Sometimes the futurist approach can totally neglect the first century context and therefore miss some lessons that should be gleaned from the book. Likewise, I think the idealist approach reminds us again that there are principles that are relevant in every era. Now, page 3 asks the question, and this is a legitimate question. This is often raised by preterists or people who reject the futurist approach. They say, what relevance would a futurist interpretation have for the original first century readers? Okay, if chapters 4 through 22 are just describing events in the distant future, what relevance does that have? Here's a helpful answer in Grant Osborne's commentary. He says this: John's readers were being asked to identify with the people at the end of history and gain perspective for their present suffering through the future trials of God's people. In other words, first century readers were going through trials. They were, in many cases, suffering persecution for their faith in Christ. And what this book does is give them a glimpse of the end, that God's people will be suffering again, but Christ is going to come and He's going to win. He's going to triumph. And so they can take heart, they can be encouraged by the message of this book. And it should encourage them to persevere in suffering. Okay. All that brings us to the purpose of the book. And here's what we have. Purpose of the book is to encourage believers by revealing the glorified Christ. Remember, chapter 1 presents this amazing picture of the glorified Christ. So, reveals the glorified Christ in His ultimate judgment. Those evil rulers that are oppressing Christians, they're going to be judged. So, the glorified Christ in His ultimate judgment and victory over His enemies, and the establishment of His eternal kingdom. Now, obviously, there are many elements, but I think that statement captures the big idea, the big purpose of this book. I've given you in your handout there something of a basic structural guide to the book. And the key text is that I'm basing this on, and a number of commentators take their structural clue from chapter 1, verse 19, which says, "Write, or therefore write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things." Okay, so notice how that breaks down. Chapter 1:19. The things which you have seen. That's chapter 1, right? Because look back at verse 10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see." Verse 12, "Then I turned to see the voice of one speaking to me, and what does he see? He sees the glorified Christ. So the things which you have seen, verse 19, chapter 1. The things which are, that describes the current condition of these churches. Chapters 2 and 3. Okay, and so there's an appropriate message for each of these churches. And again, that's a great study, the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. It's a great study because there's lots of things we can glean from the 7 churches that are applicable today for our churches. The things, because remember, these are letters directly from Christ that John is just recording. And so they reveal to us Christ's priorities. Christ does not like when a church leaves its first love. Christ does not like a lukewarm church. So, great study, chapters 2 and 3. The things which will take place after these things. Okay? Now, look at, I put it on your handout, Revelation 4:1. After these things, notice the things which will take place after these things. So, after these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things." So 4:1, link that back to 1:19, and it gives us the whole structure of the book. Okay, now what's included in the things that must take place after these things? Well, chapter 4 is a basic outline. Chapters 4 and 5, or page 4 is a basic outline. Chapters 4 and 5, the worship of heaven. And we have the opening of this book, which would, the scroll that's referred to, seem to be God's judgment, the things that unfold in the next chapters. Which 6 through 19, the tribulation period, and it's divided in 3 sets of 7. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. Now, we don't have time to look at footnote 5, but it talks about, there's always a bit of after the 6th of each thing, there's a bit of an interlude, and so if you want more details on that, look at footnote 5. Also have the appearance of the Antichrist and then the return of Christ. Chapter 20 is the millennial kingdom, the great white throne judgment, and chapters 21, 22, the eternal state. So, yes, the book of Revelation is complicated in its details, but in its big message and even in its structure, it's quite clear. And so don't be intimidated by this book. Read it. There's so much to be encouraged in through this book. Jesus is going to win.